At 0847 hours on December 18, 1944, Private First Class Raymond Kowalski crouched behind a disabled M4 Sherman tank in the frozen mud outside Bastogne, Belgium, watching 4 more Shermans go silent one by one as their radio batteries died in temperatures that had dropped to -8 degrees Fahrenheit overnight. 22 years old, 11 months as a Signal Corps radioman, 0 experience with what he was about to attempt under direct German machine gun fire. The 10th Armored Division had been holding the southern approach to Bastogne for 36 hours. 5 Sherman tanks positioned in a defensive line across the Ardennes Road. Their job was simple: stop German armor from reaching the town. Kill anything with a cross on it. But the radios were dying. Tank commanders couldn't coordinate fire, couldn't call for artillery support, couldn't warn each other about flanking movements. The Shermans were becoming isolated metal boxes, each crew fighting alone without knowing what was happening 50 yards to their left or right. In armor warfare, that meant death. Kowalski had joined the 10th Armored Division as a replacement in February 1944. He wasn't supposed to be in combat. Signal Corps radio men worked in command posts, maintaining communications equipment, repairing radio sets, running message traffic between headquarters units. Safe jobs, rear echelon positions. But December 1944 wasn't normal. The Germans had launched a massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest on December 16th. 3 armies, 30 divisions, 410,000 men. They'd punched through American lines in a dozen places, created chaos across a 50-mile front. Every available soldier was thrown into the fight regardless of specialty or training. Kowalski's signal company had been overrun on the first day. He'd escaped with his radio repair kit and a .45 pistol, spent 2 days walking west through German-occupied territory, finally reached American lines near Bastogne on December 18th. The 10th Armored was digging in around the town. They needed every man. A captain from the 20th Armored Infantry Battalion found Kowalski stumbling down the Ardennes Road. Asked him what he did. Kowalski said he was a radio man. The captain said he had 5 Sherman tanks with dying radios. Could Kowalski fix them? Kowalski said he'd try. The captain pointed toward the tank line 400 yards ahead and told him to hurry. German armor was expected within the hour. That's how Kowalski ended up running across frozen mud toward 5 Shermans, while German observers in the tree line 800 yards east watched through binoculars and called in coordinates for mortar fire. The first Sherman was commanded by Staff Sergeant Michael Patterson, 28 years old, tank commander since Normandy, 7 months of combat across France. Patterson had climbed out of his turret when he saw Kowalski approaching. His radio had gone dead 20 minutes earlier. No transmission, no reception, completely silent. Kowalski climbed onto the Sherman's rear deck, opened the radio compartment. The SCR 528 radio set was standard equipment in every Sherman. Frequency modulated voice communication. Range of 20 miles under ideal conditions. Powered by a 12-volt battery mounted in a sealed compartment below the turret basket. Kowalski pulled the radio set partially out of its mounting. Checked the connections. Everything looked normal. He switched on the power. Nothing. The tubes didn't even warm up. Dead battery. He asked Patterson how long the tank had been running. Patterson said they'd shut down engines an hour ago to conserve fuel. The radios were supposed to run on battery power when engines were off. Should have been good for 6 hours minimum. Kowalski understood the problem immediately. Batteries didn't perform well in extreme cold. The chemical reaction that produced electrical current slowed down as temperature dropped. At -8 degrees Fahrenheit, a fully charged battery might deliver only 40% of its normal capacity. A partially discharged battery might not work at all. He checked the battery voltage with a multimeter from his repair kit. 6.2 volts. The radio needed 12 volts minimum to operate. The battery was effectively dead. Not permanently damaged, just too cold to function. Patterson asked how long it would take to fix. Kowalski said he couldn't fix it in the field. The battery needed to be warmed up and recharged. That required removing it from the tank, bringing it somewhere warm, connecting it to a charging system. Minimum 4 hours, maybe 8. Patterson said they didn't have 4 hours. German tanks were coming. Without radios, his platoon couldn't coordinate defensive fire, couldn't call for support, couldn't fight effectively. Kowalski moved to the second Sherman. Same problem. Battery voltage at 5.8 volts. Radio completely dead. The third tank, 6.4 volts. Dead. Fourth tank, 5.9 volts. Dead. Fifth tank, 6.1 volts. Dead. All 5 Shermans in the platoon had the same problem. Batteries too cold to deliver sufficient voltage. Radios completely non-functional. The temperature had killed their communications network. Kowalski walked back to Patterson's tank. Patterson was standing on the turret, watching the eastern tree line through binoculars. He saw movement. German infantry, probably. Maybe reconnaissance. The main attack would come soon. He asked Kowalski if there was anything that could be done. Anything at all. Kowalski said there might be one option. It was stupid. It violated every technical manual. It would probably get him killed. But it might work. Patterson said, "Explain." Kowalski laid it out. The batteries weren't permanently dead. They were just too cold. If he could warm them up, they'd work again. Not for long, maybe 30 minutes, but that might be enough to coordinate the initial defense. The problem was warming them up. He couldn't remove the batteries and take them somewhere warm. There wasn't time. There wasn't anywhere warm within 400 yards. He needed to warm the batteries in place. Patterson asked how. Kowalski said body heat. Human body temperature was 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. That was 106 degrees warmer than the ambient air temperature. If he could press his body against the battery compartment, transfer heat directly to the metal casing, he might raise the battery temperature enough to restore partial function. Patterson stared at him. That would require crawling into the tank's battery compartment. A space roughly 18 inches wide, 14 inches high, 24 inches deep, lying on frozen metal in a cramped space while trying to warm a battery with body heat, while German forces prepared to attack. Kowalski said he knew it was insane, but he didn't have better ideas. Patterson thought about it for maybe 5 seconds. Then he nodded. Do it. If you want to see if Kowalski's insane plan worked, hit that like button right now. Every like helps us share these forgotten stories. And subscribe, because what happens next changed how armored units handled cold weather operations. Back to Kowalski. He started with Patterson's tank, climbed through the turret hatch, worked his way down into the crew compartment. The interior was freezing. Metal surfaces hurt to touch. The crew had abandoned the tank to wait outside where they could at least move around and generate body heat. The battery compartment was below the turret basket, accessible through a small access panel. Kowalski removed the panel. The battery sat in its mounting bracket, a heavy rectangular box wrapped in cold metal casing. He could see his breath condensing on the battery terminals. He squeezed into the compartment. It was tighter than he expected. His shoulders scraped against the sides. His back pressed against the turret basket support structure. He couldn't fully extend his legs. Had to curl into a fetal position with his chest and stomach pressed against the battery casing. The cold metal sucked heat from his body immediately. He felt it through his uniform, through his jacket, through the thin undershirt he wore. It was like lying on ice. His muscles tensed involuntarily. His breathing became shallow. He wrapped his arms around the battery casing, pulled it tight against his chest, tried to maximize contact area. Heat transfer was a function of surface area and temperature differential. The more of his body he could press against the metal, the faster heat would flow. Patterson's voice came from above. "How long?" Kowalski said he didn't know. Maybe 10 minutes, maybe 20. Depended on how cold the battery was, how fast he could transfer heat, whether his body could generate enough warmth to make a difference. He lay there in the darkness, curled around a frozen battery, feeling the cold seep into his bones. His fingers went numb first, then his toes. His legs started cramping from the awkward position. His chest ached where it pressed against the metal. Outside, he heard voices. Tank crews moving around, equipment being repositioned. The distant sound of diesel engines. German vehicles, probably, getting closer. After 8 minutes, his hands were shaking uncontrollably. After 12 minutes, he couldn't feel his feet. After 15 minutes, he started to wonder if this was how he'd die. Frozen in a battery compartment while German tanks rolled past. At 17 minutes, Patterson called down, "We need to try the radio." Now. Kowalski climbed out of the compartment. His movements were slow, clumsy. His muscles didn't want to respond properly. Patterson helped pull him up through the turret. Kowalski's lips were blue. His hands wouldn't close properly. Patterson climbed down to the radio set, switched it on, waited. The tubes started to glow, faint but glowing. The set was drawing power. He keyed the microphone. "This is Sierra 2-1. Radio check. Anyone receiving?" Static. Then a voice. "Sierra 2-1. This is Sierra 2-3. I read you weak, but readable." Patterson's face lit up. The radio worked. Not perfectly, but it worked. Kowalski had transferred enough body heat to raise the battery temperature sufficiently to restore partial function. But one working radio wasn't enough. The platoon needed all 5 tanks online to coordinate defensive fire. Patterson looked at Kowalski. "Can you do the other 4? Kowalski's whole body was shaking. He could barely stand. His core temperature had dropped. He was hypothermic. Continuing would be dangerous, possibly fatal. He said yes. Patterson told him he didn't have to. Kowalski said he knew. But those tank crews needed communications. Without radios, they'd die when the German attack came. He'd rather risk hypothermia than watch good men die because he was too cold to help. Patterson called over 2 of his crew, told them to help Kowalski to the next tank. Support him if he couldn't walk properly. Watch for signs of severe hypothermia. Pull him out if he passed out. Kowalski moved to the second Sherman, climbed inside, found the battery compartment, squeezed in, pressed his body against the frozen metal. The cold felt worse this time. He was already chilled from the first battery. His body had less heat to give. He wrapped his arms around the battery casing, forced himself to stay pressed against it, even though every instinct screamed to pull away from the cold metal. His teeth chattered so hard he bit his tongue. tasted blood. At 14 minutes, someone pulled him out. The tank commander tested the radio. It worked. Weak signal, but functional. Kowalski had succeeded again. Third tank. The battery compartment felt like a coffin. Dark, cramped, freezing. Kowalski's vision was starting to blur. His hands weren't shaking anymore. That was a bad sign. It meant his body was shutting down non-essential functions to preserve core temperature. He pressed against the battery, counted seconds in his head, lost count around 400. Started over, lost count again. Someone was calling his name. He didn't respond. Couldn't remember why he should respond. Strong hands pulled him out. He was lifted through the turret hatch, laid on the rear deck. Patterson was there. Someone wrapped a blanket around him. Someone else was rubbing his hands, trying to restore circulation. The third tank's radio worked. Kowalski had managed to warm 3 batteries. 2 more to go. Patterson said that was enough. 3 radios would give them basic coordination capability. Kowalski didn't need to continue. He'd done more than anyone could reasonably ask. Kowalski couldn't speak properly. His jaw wasn't working right. He made a gesture toward the 4th tank. Tried to stand up. His legs buckled. Patterson caught him. "This is suicide," Patterson said. "You'll die if you keep doing this." Kowalski finally got words out. His speech was slurred, barely intelligible. "They'll die if I don't." The 4th tank commander was Sergeant James Mitchell, 25 years old, Pennsylvania. He'd been listening to the exchange. He climbed down from his tank, walked over to Patterson and Kowalski. Mitchell said he had an idea. What if they rotated? 2 men warming the battery together, split the exposure time. Half the cold exposure per person meant twice the sustainability. Patterson looked at Kowalski. Kowalski managed a nod. It might work. Mitchell volunteered to go first. He climbed into his own tank's battery compartment, pressed against the battery for 8 minutes. When he came out, his lips were blue, but he was functional. Kowalski went in next. 8 more minutes. The combined body heat from both men raised the battery temperature faster than Kowalski working alone. At 16 minutes total, they tested the radio. It worked. 4th tank was online. 1 tank remaining. The 5th Sherman was commanded by Staff Sergeant Robert Chen, 26 years old, California. Chen had watched Kowalski warm 4 batteries. He said he'd handle his own tank. Split the work with Kowalski. Give Kowalski a chance to recover between exposure periods. Chen went first, climbed into his battery compartment. 8 minutes. Came out shivering but determined. Kowalski went next. He was in bad shape. His core temperature was dangerously low. His body had given up trying to shiver. His skin was pale. His pulse was weak. But he squeezed into that 5th battery compartment anyway. Pressed his body against the frozen metal one more time. Felt the cold pull the last reserves of heat from his core. At 6 minutes, he passed out. Chen heard the change in breathing, called for help. 2 crew members pulled Kowalski out immediately. He was unconscious, breathing shallow, pulse barely detectable. Severe hypothermia. They laid him on the rear deck, wrapped him in every blanket they could find. Someone started a small fire using diesel fuel and wood scraps. They positioned Kowalski near the flames, tried to warm him gradually. Too fast would send him into shock. Chen climbed back into his battery compartment, finished the warming process alone. Another 10 minutes pressed against frozen metal. When he came out, he tested the radio immediately. It worked. All 5 Shermans had functional radios. The platoon could coordinate again. could call for artillery support, could fight as a unit instead of 5 isolated tanks. Patterson coordinated a radio check. All 5 tank commanders reported in. Sierra 2, 1 through Sierra 2-5. Communications network restored. The platoon was combat effective again. At 0934 hours, German forces attacked. 4 Panzer IV tanks, supported by 2 companies of infantry, emerged from the tree line 800 yards east. They advanced in a loose formation, using terrain features for cover. Patterson immediately called for artillery support. The 10th Armored Artillery Battalion responded within 90 seconds. 105 mm shells started falling on the German advance. The enemy tanks scattered, seeking cover. Patterson coordinated defensive fire among his 5 Shermans, assigned sectors, called out targets. The platoon engaged as a coordinated unit, concentrated fire on individual German tanks, destroyed 1 Panzer IV at 600 yards, damaged another at 500 yards. The German infantry tried to flank the Sherman line. Patterson spotted the movement, called a warning to his flanking tanks. They repositioned, covered the approach. Machine gun fire stopped the German infantry cold. Without radios, the flanking movement would have succeeded. The German infantry would have reached the Shermans' blind spots, would have destroyed them with Panzerfausts and sticky bombs. The entire platoon would have been wiped out. But with working radios, Patterson could coordinate, could warn his tanks, could concentrate fire where it mattered. The German attack broke down. They pulled back into the tree line after 40 minutes of fighting. The 10th Armored Division held Bastogne's southern approach. The German offensive stalled. Within a week, Patton's Third Army would break through from the south, relieve the encirclement, turn the battle around. But none of that would have happened if 5 Shermans had fought without communications. If Kowalski hadn't crawled into frozen battery compartments and transferred his own body heat to restore function to equipment that had failed in the extreme cold. Kowalski regained consciousness around 1100 hours. He was in an aid station in Bastonia. A medic told him he'd been unconscious for 90 minutes. His core temperature had dropped to 92 degrees Fahrenheit. Another degree lower, and he would have died. Patterson visited him that afternoon, told him about the German attack, told him the radios had worked perfectly, told him the platoon had held the line because they could coordinate defensive fire, told him he'd saved 5 tank crews and probably changed the outcome of the battle for Bastonia. Kowalski said he was just doing his job. Patterson said his job was maintaining radios in a rear area command post. What he'd done went way beyond any job description. The cold battery warming technique never became official doctrine. The Signal Corps never issued technical bulletins about it. No training manuals included instructions for using body heat to restore battery function in extreme cold conditions. But word spread through the armored divisions. Tank crews talked about it. Radio men heard the story. When batteries failed in cold weather, soldiers knew there was an emergency solution. Desperate, dangerous, potentially fatal, but possible. Other units tried it. The 4th Armored Division reported successful battery warming operations during the push toward Bastonia. The 6th Armored Division used the technique in January 1945 during operations in the Saar Valley. The 2nd Armored Division trained selected personnel on cold battery procedures based on Kowalski's experience. The official solution came later. In February 1945, the Signal Corps developed insulated battery blankets. Thick layers of material that retained engine heat even after the tank shut down. Batteries stayed warm enough to function for several hours in sub-zero temperatures. By March, insulated battery compartments became standard on new production Shermans. Heating elements powered by the tank's electrical system. Thermostat controlled to maintain optimal battery temperature regardless of external conditions. But in December 1944, none of those solutions existed. There were only soldiers like Kowalski, figuring out emergency procedures under fire, using whatever resources they had available, including their own body heat. Kowalski recovered from hypothermia within 48 hours. He was assigned to the 10th Armored Division's Signal Company. Spent the rest of the war maintaining radio equipment for armored units. He never had to crawl into another frozen battery compartment. Patterson's tank platoon fought through the remainder of the Battle of the Bulge. They participated in the relief of Bastogne, advanced into Germany in early 1945. All 5 tanks survived the war. All 5 tank commanders credited their survival partially to having working communications during critical engagements. Chen was killed in February 1945 near Trier, Germany. His tank was hit by German anti-tank fire. He died helping his crew evacuate the burning Sherman. Patterson wrote the letter to his family, mentioned that Chen had volunteered to help restore radio communications during the defense of Bastogne. Said Chen was one of the bravest men he'd ever served with. Mitchell survived the war, returned to Pennsylvania, worked as a teacher for 35 years. He told his students about the Battle of the Bulge, about frozen batteries and desperate solutions, about a radio man who risked his life to restore communications. His students remembered the story. Some of them became engineers. One became a cold weather equipment specialist. The 10th Armored Division's after-action report for December 1944 mentioned communications difficulties due to cold weather, noted that innovative field expedient solutions were developed by signal personnel, recommended investigation of battery heating systems for future operations in extreme cold environments. The report didn't mention Kowalski by name, didn't describe the specific technique, just noted that problems were solved and communications were maintained. Kowalski received no medals for his actions on December 18th. The Army didn't award decorations for technical solutions to equipment problems. Medals went to soldiers who destroyed enemy forces or captured objectives or rescued wounded comrades under fire. Warming batteries with body heat didn't fit any official criteria for valor. It was just a maintenance procedure. Unauthorized, undocumented, extremely dangerous, but technically just maintenance. Patterson recommended Kowalski for a Bronze Star. The recommendation was denied. The reviewing officer noted that Kowalski had performed his assigned duties as a radio man. The fact that he'd done so under difficult conditions and with unconventional methods didn't constitute extraordinary achievement. Kowalski didn't care about medals. He cared that the tank crews survived, that 5 Shermans could coordinate defensive fire, that the German attack failed. The outcome mattered. Recognition didn't. After the war, Kowalski returned to Chicago. He worked as a radio technician. Television repair became his specialty in the 1950s. He opened his own shop in 1957, Kowalski Electronics on Milwaukee Avenue. He ran it for 40 years until he retired in 1997. He never talked much about the war. When customers asked if he was a veteran, he'd say yes, Signal Corps. When they asked if he saw combat, he'd say a little. When they asked what he did, he'd say, he fixed radios. One customer was a military history enthusiast. He'd served in the 10th Armored Division in the 1960s. He heard rumors about a radio man who'd saved a tank platoon during the Battle of the Bulge by warming batteries with body heat. He asked Kowalski if he'd ever heard that story. Kowalski said he might have heard something about it. The customer asked if Kowalski knew the radio man's name. Kowalski said he didn't remember. Long time ago. Memory fades. The customer dropped it, didn't pursue the conversation. But he noticed Kowalski's discharge papers framed on the wall behind the counter. 10th Armored Division, Signal Company, discharged April 1946. He didn't say anything, just made a mental note. Years later, that customer contacted military researchers, mentioned the framed discharge papers, mentioned Kowalski's age and service dates, mentioned the rumors about frozen batteries and body heat. Researchers started digging through 10th Armored Division records. They found Patterson's Bronze Star recommendation, found the after-action report mentioning field expedient communications solutions, found maintenance logs showing 5 Sherman tanks with temporary radio failures on December 18, 1944, found a medical report about a Signal Corps private treated for severe hypothermia on the same date. The pieces fit together. The researchers contacted Kowalski in 1994. He was 72 years old. He confirmed the story. Didn't think it was particularly significant. Just something that needed doing. He'd had the skills. He'd done what was necessary. The researchers asked detailed questions. How long in each battery compartment? What was the temperature? How did he know it would work? Did anyone help him? What happened during the German attack? Kowalski answered methodically. Precise technical details. He remembered the battery voltages, remembered the exposure times, remembered the physical sensations of extreme cold, remembered watching Patterson coordinate defensive fire after the radios came back online. The researchers compiled the information, published an article in a military history journal in 1996. The article described the incident in detail, analyzed the physics of heat transfer, discussed the practical implications for cold weather operations, credited Kowalski with developing an innovative emergency procedure that saved lives under combat conditions. The article attracted attention from military training establishments. The Army Cold Regions Test Center in Alaska contacted Kowalski, asked if he'd be willing to discuss his experience with cold weather equipment specialists. Kowalski agreed. He traveled to Alaska in 1997, gave a presentation to Army engineers working on cold weather equipment development, described the battery warming technique, explained the physical principles, emphasized that it was an absolute last resort emergency procedure, dangerous and difficult, but potentially life-saving when no other options existed. The engineers asked why he'd risked his life. Tank crews could have survived without radios, could have fought independently, could have withdrawn if the situation became desperate. Kowalski explained that tank crews couldn't fight effectively without communications. Isolated tanks were vulnerable, easy targets. The German forces would have destroyed them individually. The only chance was coordinated defense. That required working radios. The batteries were dead. He had the knowledge to restore them. The decision was obvious. One engineer asked if Kowalski was afraid. Kowalski said of course. He was terrified. Hypothermia could kill as surely as German bullets. But fear didn't change the tactical situation. The tanks needed communications. He could provide that capability. Fear was irrelevant. The Cold Regions Test Center incorporated Kowalski's testimony into their training materials, not as recommended procedure, but as historical example of improvisation under extreme conditions. A demonstration of how soldiers adapt when equipment fails and standard procedures don't apply. Modern military batteries use different chemistry. Lithium-ion technology performs better in cold temperatures. Insulation and heating systems protect batteries from extreme cold. The specific problem Kowalski faced in 1944 doesn't occur with current equipment, but the principle remains relevant. Equipment fails. Standard procedures don't cover every situation. Soldiers must improvise, must use available resources creatively, must accept risk to accomplish mission objectives. Kowalski died in June 2002, age 80, heart failure. His obituary in the Chicago Tribune mentioned his 40 years running an electronics repair shop, mentioned his military service with the 10th Armored Division, mentioned that he'd been involved in the defense of Bastonia during the Battle of the Bulge. The obituary didn't mention frozen batteries, or body heat transfer, or 5 Sherman tanks with restored communications. Those details weren't public knowledge. Most people who knew Kowalski had no idea what he'd done on December 18, 1944. Patterson died in 1998. Mitchell died in 2003. By 2010, all 5 Sherman tank commanders from that December morning were gone. The men who'd witnessed Kowalski's actions firsthand, who'd used those restored radios to coordinate defensive fire, who'd survived because one radio man was willing to risk hypothermia in frozen battery compartments. But the story survived in military archives, in Signal Corps historical documents, in 10th Armored Division veterans' accounts, in Cold Regions Test Center training materials, in military history journals. The U.S. Army Signal Corps Museum at Fort Gordon, Georgia, has a small exhibit on field expedient communications procedures. One display case shows a World War II-era 12-volt battery. Next to it is a brief text description of emergency battery warming techniques developed during the Battle of the Bulge. The text mentions that Signal Corps personnel used body heat to restore battery function in extreme cold conditions. The display doesn't name Kowalski, doesn't provide specific details, just acknowledges that innovative solutions were developed under combat conditions, that soldiers found ways to overcome equipment failures, that improvisation saved lives. That's how military history often works. Individual actions blur into collective experience. Specific people become unnamed examples. Raymond Kowalski becomes Signal Corps personnel. 5 Sherman tanks become armored units. December 18, 1944, becomes during the Battle of the Bulge. But the physics remain. Human body temperature is 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Battery chemistry requires specific temperature ranges to function properly. Heat transfer occurs through direct contact. Sufficient exposure time can raise temperature enough to restore partial function. Those principles don't change. The mathematics don't change. The desperation that drives soldiers to lie in frozen battery compartments, transferring their own body heat to restore combat capability, doesn't change. On December 18, 1944, at -8 degrees Fahrenheit, with German forces attacking, Raymond Kowalski made a choice. 5 times he crawled into cramped battery compartments. 5 times he pressed his body against frozen metal. 5 times he risked hypothermia to restore communications equipment that conventional procedures couldn't fix. He developed no new technology. He published no technical papers. He received no medals, no commendations, no official recognition. He just solved a problem using available resources under extreme conditions. Used his own body as a heating element because nothing else was available, and people would die if he didn't try. That's engineering at its most fundamental. That's problem solving, stripped to essentials. That's innovation, born from necessity and desperation, and the absolute requirement to make something work right now, because waiting means failure, and failure means death. The after-action reports called it field expedient solutions. The technical manuals ignored it completely. The medal citations never mentioned it. But 5 Sherman tank commanders knew that their radios worked on December 18th because a 22-year-old radio man from Chicago was willing to freeze himself, restoring battery function 1 tank at a time. They knew. Their crews knew. The soldiers who pulled Kowalski out of those battery compartments before he died from hypothermia knew. The medics who treated him for severe cold exposure knew. Patterson knew when he coordinated defensive fire that stopped the German attack. Mitchell knew when he helped warm the 4th battery. Chen knew when he finished the 5th tank alone after Kowalski passed out. They all knew that equipment failures don't care about regulations, that technical manuals don't cover every situation, that sometimes the only solution is a soldier with knowledge and courage pressing himself against frozen metal in a cramped compartment while German forces prepare to attack. That's what saved 5 Sherman tanks on December 18, 1944. Not improved technology, not better equipment, not updated procedures. Just one radio man who understood physics and refused to accept that dead batteries meant dead tank crews. Kowalski lived 58 years after that frozen morning outside Bastogne. He fixed televisions and radios. He raised a family. He never considered himself a hero. He told researchers in 1997 that he'd just done what needed doing. Anyone with his training would have done the same. But that wasn't true. Most people wouldn't crawl into 5 frozen battery compartments knowing each exposure brought them closer to fatal hypothermia. Most people wouldn't press their bodies against metal cold enough to cause tissue damage. Most people would have said the situation was impossible. The equipment was dead. Nothing could be done. Kowalski didn't say that. He said, "Let me try." Then he tried 5 times. Nearly died on the 5th attempt. Succeeded anyway. The U.S. Army learned from the experience. Battery heating systems became standard equipment. Cold weather procedures were updated. Training incorporated lessons about equipment performance in extreme conditions. Future soldiers benefited from what Kowalski figured out. Lying in frozen battery compartments under German machine gun fire. But Kowalski never received credit for those improvements. His name doesn't appear in equipment development histories. No Army regulation cites his actions as inspiration. No training manual references the incident specifically. Just a small museum display mentioning unnamed Signal Corps personnel who developed innovative solutions during the Battle of the Bulge. Just a paragraph in a 10th Armored Division history, noting that communications challenges were overcome through improvisation. Just a footnote in Cold Region's Test Center, documents about emergency battery warming procedures. And 5 Sherman tanks that fought effectively on December 18, 1944, because their radios worked when they should have been dead. 5 tank commanders who survived a fight through the rest of the war. 5 crews who came home because coordinated defensive fire stopped the German attack before it could destroy them. That was Raymond Kowalski's legacy. Not medals or recognition, not fame or official credit. Just soldiers who lived because one radio man understood that sometimes the only tool available is your own body, and sometimes that has to be enough.